Pure dominance. That's exactly what you get with a fighter like this.
Herb might jump in.
Alexander Volkanovski's latest string of victories has shown the world another level of championship dominance, and he's propping himself to be one of the greatest fighters of this current era. He has incredible durability, endless stamina, and the fortitude to survive some of the most challenging opposition the featherweight division has to offer. And after witnessing him take heavy shots, surviving the most dangerous submissions, and even outclassing all of his challengers, it's hard to deny the fact there's something really special about Alexander Volkanovski. This is an analysis on the signature craft of an incredible fighter. After his trilogy fight with Max Holloway, he made a big statement through a dominant performance, and what's most surprising is that he actually performed much better. But the question here is how? In the first fight, Volkanovski managed to edge out a convincing victory. As the rematch took place, Volk wanted to be even more dominant in the second fight to make his statement and shut out all the doubters. However, the waters were muddied, and the victor of that second fight wasn't as clear. You see, Max was able to close the gap in order to make the fight much more competitive, and he did it by making very specific changes. I'll review those adjustments he made in this video because they actually played a role in how the final trilogy played out. So up to that point, Max slowly caught up to close the gap, but after the trilogy fight, Volk was the one who caught up, and he didn't just catch up, he surpassed one of the most dominant and skilled fighters in the division in a very convincing way. He managed to become even better than what he already was. So the trilogy fight changed everything, and that's why we're here today, to take a look at the signature craft between the two and break down how Volk did it and the changes that occurred. His fight really sparked my curiosities because I wanted to know why Volk was so dominant this time around and what was different about their habits. As one of the best fighters out there right now, Alexander Volkanovski's skills are worth studying for someone who's looking to improve the understanding of high-level fighting, so stick around because I'm going to show you how he pulls it off. Really interesting things took place here, and I'm going to show you what I discovered, but in order to understand why the trilogy fight played out the way it did, we first need to take a look in the past in order to understand the present. We learned one of the key game plans for beating Max in their first fight was to use kicks. There was a specific reason for this. Volk's team mentioned that Max's defense weren't as great when he fights in southpaw. Moreover, Max tends to fight in an orthodox stance with a lot of weight over his lead foot. I went into details about the game plan in a previous video, so you can check that video out in the description, but the key idea I want you to know is that they wanted to remove Max from using his leaning orthodox stance, so Volk's team had him use a lot of kicks. This accomplished two important things. First, by kicking the leg, it stopped Max from using his lean forward stance. Now the stance tends to be an offensive stance that allows Max to set up a lot of his attacks, but he can't quite defend kicks well with too much weight on the front foot. It makes it harder to block kicks with too much weight towards your front foot since you usually need to be balanced between both of your feet in order to move the leg away from attacks. The second thing is that leg kicks didn't just force Max into an upright stance, it also forced him into using more of a southpaw stance. Volk's team wanted to exploit this because he had a lot of defensive openings in southpaw, so as a result what you saw was that Volk was able to attack the legs, force Max upright, and then change his stance in order to score his shots. Coming into the rematch, Max managed to make adjustments that made it much more competitive. Max came in a little bit more upright with his stance, allowing him to handle kicks better, and he also kept the orthodox stance more and didn't allow himself to move into the southpaw stance. These were important changes since it mitigated Volk's ability to exploit leg kicks and Max's defensive openings from southpaw. Because these changes were so useful, Max carried these adjustments going into their trilogy fight. On top of these defensive adjustments, Max also implemented more offensive tools that played into Volk's specific habits. For example, Volk used a lot of dipping movements where he lowers his level as he attacks or moves forward. One example was Volk's step over technique. This is a technique where he would throw his power shot, keep a low posture while stepping over to throw another power shot. This landed quite often, however, since Volk kept his body relatively in place during these kind of movements, knees were an effective way of deterring or intercepting these kind of movements. Max started using knees and the threat of knees more frequently, and you could see in one situation where Volk was about to do a step over, he gets intercepted by Max's knee, and this became something a little bit more frequent as Max caught on. Overall, the adaptations of more knee attacks were valuable enough that you could see Max utilizing them into their trilogy fight as well. Even if it didn't land, the threat of those knees were enough to make Volk think twice about using the dipping movements. Volk was more cautious with those knees and barely ever used his signature step over at all for the rematch or even the trilogy fight. Volk had to respect the threat of those knees, and he made adjustments accordingly. The addition of the knees also meant that Max could mix in different kicking tricks to fight at long range, so typically you would see Max using a lot of knee fakes into kicking setups. These kind of tricks worked pretty well in the rematch, and it appeared that Max wanted to keep utilizing them in the trilogy fight as well. The threat of the knee ensures Volk stay upright to avoid the knees, and this worked in Max's favor since he would use a lot of knee threats and then switch into something like a head kick attempt. It seemed early on that Max had a lot of focus setting up his punches, but as rounds went on, his corner let him know that he was behind on the scorecards. So at that point, we saw a slight shift in Max's approach. He was more inclined to use a lot of heavy attacks and spinning kicks to find that one ending shot, because it seemed like it might have been his only way to pull off the win. Max typically looks a pressure forward throughout the fight, and this was a difficult task to accomplish because Max couldn't quite find his rhythm going on the offensive. I found that Volk wouldn't stay in range to allow Max to create his setups. Volk had a good mastery of range in this fight, and you'll see down the road why this made such a big difference in the overall theme of this fight. Volk would rarely be in range unless it was on his own terms, and it makes it frustrating since Max had a lot of troubles walking Volk down to land his own craft, and when Max did land, it was usually because Volk voluntarily came into range by choice. There were moments where Max could put Volk on the back foot using his double jab combos, but consistency faded drastically as Volk found his counter rhythm, and you'll see later on how. When Volk did come into range on those occasions, Max would land his signature jab counter. When opponents commit forward with the jab, Max liked to use his signature rear parry to deflect the jab, and then come back with a volume of jabs followed by his power shot. He tends to land this specific counter quite often against his opponents. During many sequences, Max would come in with a jab and then frame on Volk's neck. Now this kind of trapped him in place and controlled his posture, and it also partially blinded Volk, so he couldn't really see, so this allowed Max to follow up with his shot. Later in the rounds, Max's corner wanted him to keep pressuring forward, but they also wanted him to bait Volk out forward to counter his counter. So after studying the footage, this made a lot of sense to me, mainly because the most significant shots Max could land clean on was where he was able to get Volk to commit forward to counter him with his signature rear parry jab follow-up. Max would always try to look for that counter the whole fight. However, this wasn't quite enough, but Volk did many things that made it really hard to land on him. At every attempt to find shots, Volk presented a very difficult hurdle to overcome. I mentioned earlier that Volk has a very good mastery of range, and he does this in a variety of ways through the use of his footwork and limb control. He doesn't carelessly enter the striking zone until he takes control of the risk factors. One of the ways that he does this is by hand fighting. This usually occurs when both fighters are in a neutral range where neither can land their punches, and this is where they engage in hand fighting to control and gauge the range. In order to breach that range, fighters usually have a host of various tactics to breach through. One of those tactics is to control the opponent with his lead arm and then fire his power shot. By controlling that hand, this allows Volk to control one of the opponent's weapons. This allows him to breach through that range with his attacks on his own terms to land shots with minimum risk. These are habits you probably are familiar with following my work since we observed him using this against other fighters as well. There is one particular hand control tactic that really amused me throughout the story of their fights, and it's a tactic where Volk would use his rear hand to control one of the opponent's weapons, then he would hop step forward into range of his jab to follow up with his power shots. Volk used his tactic quite often in the first fight, and it worked so well that he continued it into their second fight. However, things didn't play out as well, because Max found his timing to counter it when Volk would use this. As Volk hop stepped forward with the jab, Max would slip and parry the jab and then come back with his own uppercut. Volk has a tendency to dip his head after missing the shot, so Max would consistently slip and uppercut Volk, raising his head up for a follow-up shot. This was pretty effective since Max would often catch Volk hopping forward into the power of his uppercut. So if you're like me, you were probably wondering, Did Max find a concrete way of countering this specific tactic using his slip uppercut? And the short answer is not really, and it's complicated. Even though Max could find a way to succeed landing this specific counter, he couldn't quite find the same counter in the trilogy fight. In fact, in my observations, Max didn't attempt to even use the slip uppercut counter at all when Volk would use his tactic to hand control and hop step forward with his jab. Although I'm not exactly sure why Max didn't use his counter, there are a few things I did notice that may explain why. The biggest observation was that Volk used his tactic very sparingly, and if he did use his tactic, it would be hard to anticipate because it rarely comes out. The other likely thing is that Volk's rhythm was just a lot harder to predict this time around. You can't really tell when he's about to come forward to attack or retreat, and most of the time that you see Volk landing this tactic, it was usually when Max the least expects it. His sense of timing is really important here, and you'll see why soon enough later in the video. Another common form of hand fighting was Volk's method of controlling the opponent's weapons with his lead hand and then reaching through with his own jab. Again, this follows the same idea we went over earlier. To give you an idea of how this works, Volk will usually probe right out of range controlling Max's weapon. Now before he breaches through, he'll control that weapon first, step through, and you're going to notice now that he's in range. Now this is a way for him to enter range on his own terms, controlling Max's weapons. This is a very common tactic that Volk uses by controlling that lead hand and breaching through, and this is something that he used quite a lot against Brian Ortega, and ironically both Max and Volk use the same tactic. This was a very common jab breaching tactic that Volk found a lot of success with. Volk's jab overall is really versatile and impressive. Not only was he able to control the range with his jab, he was also able to make things up, like creating other openings. You would see instances where he would reach out with a jab, then switch to a sidestep hook to move around Max's parry. Volk made excellent use of good footwork and angles to move around in a way that allowed him to attack while protecting himself using several defensive layers. Now those defensive layers are pretty important to know about, but since I've covered them so much on my channel, you might be familiar with them already, so I won't cover those details here. But if you're new here, you might be interested in watching one of my videos of Rafon vs Jose Aldo, where I break down the defensive layers of how to attack with a jab with multiple built-in defenses. The most important takeaway here is that Volk's use of defensive movement played an important role in attacking Max without sustaining much damage. Volk's lateral movement actually played well into how Max was attacking as well. Max uses a lot of different kicking feints and setups, but using lateral movement tends to be a nice natural way to nullify some of those setups. You would see things like Volk sidestepping from an attack when Max would try a kick, and you'll notice that the lateral movement actually allows Volk to move away from those attacks while simultaneously attacking Max back. Volk was able to take control of the fight well with his jab. He would often pierce the jabs through, but his execution was so fast that Max had a really hard time landing his counters. Aside from Volk's incredible speed, his technique really helped with this. Volk never really overextends his head past his lead foot when he's throwing his jab. He always carries his feet with him, and this is important because this also means his feet are always bounced between him to retreat backwards at any moment. Just take a look at this example. Even though Max's attack hand is so close to Volk's head, Volk's stance is so well balanced that he could quickly pull right away. His stance is incredibly important fundamental to master when executing the jab, and you can see at the highest level of combat how important the basics play amongst the best fighters in the world. Also keep in mind that having good execution like this is very important because it makes it really hard for Max to execute his signature jab counter where he rear parries and then follows up with his jabs. It's interesting because Max couldn't quite land his signature jab counter too much since Volk would jab then retreat out of range right away. You would see some adjustments where Max would try to parry and then follow up with a head kick instead to make up for Volk's evasive distance, but even then Volk was still able to evade. You would also see Volk use the jab to draw Max forward so that he could counter Max's counter. One example is when Volk would fire his jab, draw Max forward, evade the shot, and then counter back with a hook or some kind of power shot. So at this point, you start to notice that Volk's jab was really versatile. He could use it to reach through hand fighting in the battle for range, and he was also able to apply the jab to bait Max forward into his own counters. The next ability is quite possibly the most devastating tool in Volk's arsenal. Give me a second to show you this really cool wallet. It has protection against RFID tech that can steal your card info, a really useful card holder, and you can use a tracker to find your wallet or your phone. Link is in the description. Let's get back to the video. And it was the use of his rhythm. When I look at the totality of this fight, I realized that the things Volk landed were a lot of the same techniques he's used in the past, but he managed to land it much better and more consistently this time. So what was different, and why was he more consistent in landing this time? As I looked over the body of evidence, the common theme that I saw was that Volk was able to land much better because of his sense of deceptive rhythm. His timing and his ability to manipulate Max into his timing got a lot better. Max walked down Volk often, but Volk uses it against him. For example, Volk would circle away, Max would follow up, but Volk would time his advancing shots in moments where Max was least expecting it. You'll notice that Max follows up to Volk's position, his feet are barely planted, and then Volk uses that timing to burst in when Max least expected. You're going to see it again here. He follows up, his feet are barely planted, and then Volk uses his timing to burst forward. And you see in these examples too that Volk's sense of deceptive rhythm is very good, always timing his shots when Max's feet aren't quite planted well, taking advantage of Max being in bad positions. One of the most effective counters Volk throws has got to be his power shot into a lead straight. Out of all of his fights, this counter still remains to be one of the most consistent and effective techniques Volk has thrown thus far. When it came to the counter game, Volk does a really good job of throwing this very effectively. One of the common methods of landing this is when Volk would fade back slightly, then abruptly change his rhythm to burst forward with this attack. This is a really effective counter, especially against opponents who are looking to walk you down. One of the tricky things that pressure fighters have to watch out for is opponent's sudden change in direction when coming forward. This makes Volk's power shot into a lead straight counter so effective, because one moment you think you're walking him down, then Volk fades back, then all of a sudden he bursts forward to attack you. Volk would throw his power shot, typically a cross, and follow up with the lead straight, so it's tricky because when you throw the cross, a natural follow-up shot is typically a lead hook, but Volk will instead throw a straight shot. Now the straight shot is the closest path to the opponent, so it tends to come out quicker. In this instance, when Volk throws his power shot, he's going to follow up the lead hand shot, but you're going to notice that his hand is closer to Max, so he actually lands his shot first during the exchange. What this meant is that in many of these exchanges, his lead shot will almost always come out first and connect even before Max get a chance to counter back. This kind of shot selection makes Volk's counter very hard to interrupt from what I was able to see. If for some reason Max tries to retreat from the initial cross, Volk will typically hop step forward with his lead straight to close the distance and still connect. So when you look at this signature counter, overall it's hard to interrupt because of the shot selection. It's hard to predict because Volk disguises it in deceptive rhythm, and if by some chance you are able to evade the first shot, Volk accounts for this and he hop steps into your range anyways to land his shot. And then there's the defensive part of this execution. It's pretty impressive how Volk throws his cross into a lead straight because he rarely gets hit with his signature move, and he has several ways to implement this counter while staying defensively sound. One method is by throwing the cross and then hop stepping at an angle with his jab. This displaces Volk into a new defensive angle and it makes it harder for shots to find him in this new position. Another variation is that he will combine his straight shot with a pivot, so when he throws his cross, he'll pivot and throw his straight lead at the same time, and the pivot works defensively because it moves you away from the attack position to avoid attacks while you're delivering your own shot. This is just an example of a defensive pivot. Notice that if Volk jabs, he's going to turn his body. Now this is going to work like a door opening up, and this displaces his body by just a few inches here, and this is where you're going to see that Max is going to miss his shot due to the pivot. This is just an alternate example here for a pivot. You're going to notice here the opponent's going to try to attack in that green circle, and then you're going to notice that Whitaker is going to pivot, and you're going to notice that he displaces his head with the pivot, and you're going to see that the shot's going to miss as the pivot happens. This helps illustrate how pivots can be helpful. One different variation is that Volk will sometimes use his rear arm to control rather than throwing the cross. He'll catch Max's arm with one hand and then he'll drive his lead straight right in. Volk is always defensively aware whenever throwing his cross into a lead shot. He's always dipping or slipping or fading away, usually after throwing the shot, just to avoid getting countered back. This counter shot was actually a pretty common counter in the first fight too. Max would typically use a lot of hopping kicks or feints on Volk, and Volk would use his signature counter really well to counter Max's kick attempts. What's cool about this technique is that Volk will often fade back, bending that knee to create a sturdy base, and this makes it a little bit harder for Max to hyperextend that knee if he were to kick Volk there. Naturally, the hop forward delete shot was very useful to close that range because Max usually works on his kicking range. It shows how useful this counter could be against kicking setups. Volk's signature counter was so effective that it forced Max to mix up his kicking setups to make him less predictable, but despite this, history has a strange way of repeating, and you still occasionally see Volk landing this counter when Max attempts his hopping sidekick attempts. Even though this combo seems so simple, the execution of Volk's rhythm is just on another level, and this makes a big difference in the fight. To pull it all together, Max Holloway is an extremely skilled fighter who dominates. For years, Max Holloway and Alexander Volkanovski stood at the top as the two very best in the division as close rivals. Volk dominated the flow of the trilogy fight, but credit goes to both fighters because they forced each other to become even better through the years, and many improvements came along with this. Alexander Volkanovski has only gotten better, and we saw that through his incredible speed, his good technique, deceptive rhythm, and a strong mastery of range control. Iron sharpens iron, and whoever faces these two guys next have a very tough hurdle ahead of them. Alexander Volkanovski has a really well-rounded skill set for MMA, and everything about him is impressive, from his durability, his counter game, his baiting ability, his feinting, and even his attack style. With a fighter this well-rounded, it's really hard to deny the fact that there's something really special about Alexander Volkanovski. But is he the world's best fighter? I'll leave that up to you to decide. At the moment, I just produced a comprehensive video on counterpunching, and it's a really important skill set to have. If you think about it, the jab is one of the most common punches in combat. It would only make sense to develop an effective counter to it. This is where the infamous pull counter comes in. I created a very detailed guide breaking down very important principles that you'll want to be aware of to improve your ability to land this much better. These are ideas that made a big difference for me, and I'm trying to give those details for you so that you can make use of those details. You have access for this for the time being by subscribing to my newsletter or email. I mainly am going to use this to stay connected with you and stay connected with those who want access to my work. I don't know how long I'm going to be on YouTube, so this always allows me to stay connected with everyone who follows my work regardless of where I go, and it really helps me out. Alright, thanks for watching. Watch out for a future possible Patreon for new and different content aimed for more invested followers of this channel.